Unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved.
But we're not talking about Jews, we're talking about Gentiles.
The law does not bend Gentile or Jew. Moses is very clear. We've always said that we follow the law. Moses' law.
Barnabas and I have found many wonderful things in our travels. Jesus, who's called Christ in the lands to the west.
And the believers are called Christians. Christians.
Oh, we like this word.
Now, I spoke yesterday to one of the, what's his name, the professor from Edinburgh? Balcom. And he said, I played a little devil's advocate with him and did a little Eisenman with him. He says, yeah, you can't, on the evidence, James, Peter, Paul, they all got along like a house on fire. Yeah, they differed a little bit about, they didn't agree, the issue was not, of course, James thought the Jews shouldn't start breaking the law. That wasn't an issue. Wasn't an issue for Paul. They really, what was the relationship going to be between Gentiles and Jews? So they all got together. Everybody's making a big deal about factionalism. I don't see any factionalism, he says. Basically, they got along. They had little issues about how does the Gentile movement and the Jewish movement, sit at the same table. That's all. Eisenman and the rest of them are saying conflict, where there are no conflicts.
There's total conflict. All you have to do is look at Galatians, where Peter and Paul and the others are in this special place called Antioch, where Christians were first called Christians. By the way, I don't think it's a normative Antioch. I think it's this place in northern Syria, Syriac Antioch. There were 5 Antiochs. This is Edessa in northern Syria. I'm sure that's where it was. That's where things were going on. They were all called Antioch. But the point is, then the messengers of James came down with his instructions to oversee communities. And Paul himself admits that all of the people who used to keep table fellowship with Gentiles stopped doing it and withdrew because of the party of the circumcision. They call James's party the party of the circumcision and the messengers from James. Even Peter did this, and he said, and I accused him to his face and said, Peter, you are a hypocrite. And in any case, after that, Barnabas leaves Paul, and everyone shuns him from that moment on, and he will only travel with non-Jewish Gentile traveling companions like Timothy and others of that kind, Lucas, etc. So you tell me that's a minor dispute? That's a major dispute when all of his close companions desert him and refuse to have anything to do with him. Now, if you look in Essene practice, the Essenes have a characteristic of shunning. They expel people from the community for various things, and then they shun him in work and activity. This is exactly what's going on here with Paul and the others in the Antioch scene, and it's clear that we're having quasi-Essene practice going on here of a very familiar kind. So these arguments are very deep. I will say one last thing about that. Paul constantly cavils against the chief apostles. He constantly says, who are these people? Pillars? Not that their importance means anything to me. He says things like men of knowledge. Are they men of knowledge? Then he makes some nasty comments and says they're not even able to tell the difference that an idol is nothing. They make trouble over eating food sacrificed to idols, one of the strictures of James's rulings. An idol is nothing in the world, he says. And then at the end of Corinthians 2, he said, Hebrews are they? So am I. Super apostles are they? So am I. And he makes clear that the people who he's heaping abuse on are the super Jewish apostles who are over him, and he's constantly caviling and making a snide allusions to them that anyone in his right mind, except someone who wants to just make everything look rosy, would realize had to do with severe internal strife. The final thing he says in Galatians, he's talking to his communities and the super apostles coming and bothering them. What they're bothering them about is circumcision. And he says in one nasty outbreak, tell those who are bothering you, I wish they would themselves cut off. Meaning I wish they would themselves, their own sexual parts cut off, making it look as if circumcision is cutting off your sexual parts, but also parroting the fact that Essenes expelled outsiders by cutting them off. So he does a double entendre there in the real ferocious antagonism he feels to these so-called Jamesian Jewish Christians who were insisting on circumcision?
So the infighting was real.
Severe. Severe.
It seems that Paul was more absorbed by his growing Gentile mission. Widespread conversions, he believed, heralded God's kingdom. But as more Gentiles joined, Paul's recruits were also bringing vexing changes to the Jewish Jesus movement. Judaic laws were being abridged, Jewish customs set aside, and some of Paul's Jewish colleagues found that trend increasingly disturbing.
The more Gentiles who came into the church, the more difficult it was for particularly the earliest members of that community to determine what they were supposed to do, how they were supposed to behave. Eventually, if Gentiles outnumbered Jews, who was going to control the church? By what practices were Jesus followers to be known?
These questions began to emerge in Antioch as early as the year 49. About that time, Peter arrived from Jerusalem. It may be that Peter was fulfilling his part of the Jerusalem agreement. He may have been preaching to Antioch's large Jewish community, while Paul and Barnabas addressed the city's Gentiles. Whatever the arrangement, it seems Peter adapted to local conditions. He welcomed non-Jewish followers and ate at non-kosher tables. But the concord would not last. New men arrived from Jerusalem. Antioch's Jesus followers seemed to be flouting the most distinctive laws of Judaism. Laws delivered by Moses, which prohibited non-kosher food and went to the heart of Jewish identity.
For hundreds of years, Jewish martyrs had died to observe the Jewish law. Now, Paul is saying that pagans can become full Jews without being converted, so what they had died for was now somehow abrogated or could be skipped or could be bypassed. And for many Jews, that was just not acceptable.
The men from Jerusalem insisted the Jewish leaders take their meals apart from non-kosher Gentiles. They invoked all the authority of the Jerusalem apostles, men who had known Jesus personally, and in James's case, were even members of his family. Peter and Barnabas acquiesced. But Paul accepted no retreat. Furious at his colleagues for backpedaling, he gave Peter a public tongue-lashing.
I opposed him to his face because he was self-condemned. For before certain people came from James, he'd eaten with the Gentiles, but when they arrived, he withdrew, fearing those in the circumcision faction. The remaining Jews joined his hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was led astray.
It's hard to tell just how far Paul pushed this. Is this where the schism happened, over just this issue of table fellowship? It's possible, but we don't know for sure.
We do know that the conflict over table fellowship exposed a deep rift between the visions of Paul and James. Peter, the mediator, could not hold the two together. It seems the crisis caused Paul to break with Barnabas, to turn his back on the community he worked almost a decade to build. And worse, it seems the crisis fractured Paul's hope for a single Jesus movement. That movement confronted the most portentous crossroads in its short history.
What is at stake in this is if we're going to have a Gentile Christian community and a Jewish Christian community, are we going to have two churches or one? If we're going to have one, how are they to be integrated together? That's what's at stake in this. How is the church, with these two wings, these two divisions, as it were, how is it to remain one church? Is it going to remain one church?
Tax collectors would have confiscated it all. But you necessity.
As you all know, I try and tell the truth at all times, even when I know it is not a truth that everyone wants to hear. Tonight we are all happy that Peter has been here with us in Antioch for the past month, and we are glad that Benjamin and others have brought good tidings from James in Jerusalem. But, some of us are engaging in a hypocrisy since Benjamin arrived. Some of us used to eat with the Gentiles in this group, and as soon as Benjamin arrived, they shunned the Gentiles. This is hypocrisy.
Who are you speaking of, Paul?
You. And Peter. I'm sorry, Peter, but it's true. As soon as James' people arrived from Jerusalem, you pulled back from the Gentiles. You were afraid of criticism because of the controversy over those who are circumcised and those who are not.
It's a very serious question.
To some, perhaps. To me, it is a mockery of Jesus' teaching.
It is the law that believers must be circumcised.
Believers in the law?
You're abandoning the law?
When Gentiles, who do not possess the law, do instinctively what the law requires, they are the law unto themselves. What the law requires is written on their hearts.
Many who follow Jesus believe that they must accept the law also.
Christ is the end of the law. The end of the law, so there may be righteousness for everyone who believes.
This is too serious a question to decide here tonight.
There should be a meeting of all the elders to decide this question.
Barnabas is right. We will meet in Jerusalem in 1 month's time.
The next day, Paul and the rest of us went to see James, and all the elders were present. Paul greeted them and reported in detail what God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. When they heard this, they praised God. Then they said to Paul,
"You see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law. They have been informed that you teach all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or live according to our customs. What shall we do? They will certainly hear that you have come. So do what we tell you. There are 4 men with us who have made a vow. Take these men, join in their purification rites, and pay their expenses so that they can have their heads shaved. Then everybody will know there is no truth in these reports about you, but that you yourself are living in obedience to the law. As for the Gentile believers, we have written to them our decision that they should abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality."
The next day, Paul took the men and purified himself along with them.
Paul had envy for James, he had antagonism to James, and he literally probably wanted to destroy James. And when he was arrested in the 60s by the Roman governors and held in protective custody, even when Sicarii had taken an oath to kill Paul because of introducing Gentiles in the temple, what happens in Caesarea in Acts, which is now an historical part in Acts, not an overwritten, looks more like a debriefing session. And it's funny, no members of his community come down to visit him at all. And he's being housed in Agrippa I's palace there. And ultimately, they get him out of the country on a appeal to Caesar. But to have stayed in the country would have meant his death. There were so many people who wanted to kill him for what he. But they didn't want to kill James. James wasn't being hunted down or anything. James went on functioning as if nothing was happening while Paul was under arrest. Yes, I think that was very severe, even unto death. I think ultimately, this is way beyond where I would like to be. Paul, with his discussions with the Roman authorities, would have given information that led to the final demise of people like James.
Paul was a collaborator?
Paul could not have gone to Rome and then been freed in Rome, and the way he went, without entering Roman service of some kind, and he held a Roman citizenship. So he went to Rome in 62, the time just when James was killed in Jerusalem. You know, the book of Acts ends not with James's death, where it should end, the leader of the whole. It ends with Paul under loose house arrest in Rome, and it doesn't look like he's going to be executed then, because he's not executed for another 8 years, and the stories are that he goes on to Spain and elsewhere. I even think he came back to Palestine in the meantime. There's a character Josephus described called Saul, who's a member of the Herodian family, who also makes an appeal to Caesar, and very definitely is in the service of the Roman authorities. So I don't say he's a collaborator. He's someone whose allegiances are worrisome.
Where does the tradition that he goes to Spain come from?
It's he mentions in one of his letters that he wants to go to Spain, and then some of the extra biblical material talks about his having gone to Spain. So if he went to Spain, and if he returned to Palestine, which I have a reason to believe he did, before he died around 68 in the midst of the uprising, the Romans have just rounded up all troublemakers by that time and executed everybody, and the dragnet would have included people like Paul by that point. But if he returned to Palestine, then he'd have to have entered service in some way, like Josephus did. Josephus went to Rome. When he came back, he was in Roman service. That's how he saved his skin. You cannot go to Rome and come back. You can't go to Stalinist Russia and come back. Free, I mean.
They chose James the Just as overseer of Jerusalem.
James the Just is recorded to have been the first elected to the throne of the oversight of the church in
The
Jerusalem.
succession of the church passed to James, the brother of the Lord.
Father Dean Burchard, why is James so marginalized in church history? I mean, we see no pictures or statues of him in Rome.
Yeah, that's true, and unfortunately, most of the history of that Jerusalem church is lost. If it were not for Luke, with recording the few little things that he learned, we'd know next to nothing at all. You know, and so most of that history is lost, and it's tragic.
So you don't believe Luke was trying to write James out of the story and promote Paul over James?
Well, it's true. I mean, that's an issue in the study of the Acts of the Apostles, you know, that it's a selective history.
The disciples said to Jesus, "We know that you're going to leave us. Who will be our leader?" Jesus replied to them, "No matter where you are, you're to go to James the Just, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being."
Then some of the believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees stood up and said,
"The Gentiles must be circumcised and required to obey the law of Moses."
The apostles and elders met to consider this question. When they finished, James spoke up.
Brothers, it is my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. Instead, we should write to them, telling them to abstain from food polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from the meat of strangled animals, and from blood.
Then they said to Paul,
You see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law. They have been informed that you teach all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or live according to our customs. What shall we do? So do what we tell you. There are 4 men with us who have made a vow. Take these men join in their purification rites and pay their expenses so that they can have their head shaved. Then everybody will know there is no truth in these reports about you, but that you yourself are living in obedience to the law.
When they saw that the gospel of the uncircumcision was committed unto me, as the gospel of the circumcision was unto Peter, for he that wrought effectually in Peter the apostleship of the circumcision, the same was mighty in me toward the Gentiles. And when James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given unto me, they gave to me and Barnabas the right hands of fellowship, that we should go unto the heathen, and they unto the circumcision. Only they would that we should remember the poor, the same which I also was forward to do.
That Christianity came to be this creedal confession of the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus, Christmas and Easter, two main holidays, and yet we find in the book of James, or the letter of James, that's not the emphasis. So what is the emphasis? Is the view of true religion based upon the Hebrew prophets. It basically is the question, what does God really require of humans? It's a universal question. You know, Micah, I'm talking about Micah, Amos, Hosea, these ringing prophets that talk about justice and righteousness. If you're kind of critical of Paul, you'd say, oh, wait a minute, he never even met Jesus. Shouldn't we go more by what Jesus taught and what people that knew Jesus taught, like James, his own brother, or Peter, who was with him, Cephas or Cephas, rather than the visionary experience of somebody who never actually met him? And how do we know how to credit that visionary experience?